Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of Innovation Deciphered. With me today is Huw Gullick of the National Oceanography Centre.
Correct.
Welcome, Huw.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. Thank you for having me. I look after at the National Oceanography Centre. I look after our interface with industry. So my official title is Associate Director for NOC Innovation, but effectively what that really means is kind of two hats. Working with industry based on the science and the research that we do, and helping industry use that sort of fundamental science. And then the other element is sort of projecting 10, 15 years into the future and thinking about really what humanity's challenges and problems may be, and then kind of coming right back to the here and now and looking at what we're doing from an ocean sciences perspective, and seeing if I can take that IP, that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the stuff that we're doing, and see how that could be used in the future for the benefit of humanity, which is awfully philosophical, but it really is that broad. So that's my role. It's sitting in that innovation science space.
And that's why we've asked you on the podcast, because we're obviously all about innovation and innovation management. So tell me a little bit more about the sorts of ranges of sciences and bits of engineering that the NOC involves itself with.
Sure. No. So we cover pretty much every type of ocean science discipline, from understanding coastal ocean science right through to deep ocean, and we've got the capability to kind of go anywhere in the world. So we undertake everything from sort of ocean physics, climatic processes, deep sea ecology, geological processes, all these types of scientific disciplines, but in the ocean environment, all over the world. And that's fundamentally really, really important for how we exist on land, because the ocean touches every single person's life. You often think about it when you go down to the beach or coastal communities, but the reality is the ocean dictates how we live everywhere on Earth, from climate change, the oxygen that we breathe, all these things fundamentally come back to the ocean, the weather that we experience as well. So our role as a centre is principally to understand the ocean environment and provide that understanding, that knowledge to society, so for public benefit, to inform policy and regulation about how we interact with the ocean, to help industry and those organisations that operate in the ocean environment. So our scope is absolutely huge, and we do that through having core sort of scientific infrastructure on land, but we also have a fleet of equipment that we use at sea. Some of that is traditional research, large research vessels, which people will probably be familiar with, right through to completely autonomous, unmanned, effectively submarines. So all this equipment effectively gathers data from the ocean environment. We bring that data back, we scientifically interpret that, and then we can understand our ocean environment better.
Give me an idea. How many staff have you got? How many vessels have you got?
Yeah, no. So we've got two Royal Research ships. So there are three that exist in the UK. We manage two of those. So they are based when at home in our site in Southampton. We've also got a site in Liverpool as well. So they're principally our three sites: ships, Southampton, Liverpool. Within that, we've got a total of around 680 staff. And the broad split is about 60 to 70% science and engineering, and the remaining sort of 30-ish% support staff, indirect functions. So we're heavily weighted towards the kind of STEM disciplines. And those technical roles are typically research roles, and that's a key difference between an institute or an organisation like ours and a kind of normal engineering business. We don't have shareholders. We don't have to make profit. We're a charitable organisation that works on getting research funding, so we can dedicate our time to fundamentally doing scientific and engineering research. So we sit in that space.
Now, our viewers are really interested in exactly that stuff, which is engineering, science, doing research. Presumably, you've got masses and masses of projects. How do you control all that? What's the process for coming up with a project and then managing it through?
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept, and I wouldn't say that we've got it right, because I don't think there is a right. So if you look at our funding, about 90% of our funding comes from scientists and engineers applying to research bodies, effectively. And that might be a UK government research body, it might be a European one, European Space Agency, whatever that is. And they do so, and that could be a project that lasts anything from 6 months to 3 years. If they win that funding, that then effectively gives them the mandate to then go and undertake their research. So you're right, we have a huge number of different projects on a huge range of subjects being researched at any one point. The sort of back office management of that, ultimately there's nothing particularly intellectual about it. So we have a very strong legal and governance process, firstly for deciding what we bid to research on. But then when we start doing that research, what we do with the intellectual property that is being developed. And this can be intellectual property from real kind of early idea stuff, much higher up the sort of technology readiness level, near what you would see in the normal sort of commercial engineering world. So we manage that sort of IP portfolio in terms of a sort of gated process. So trying to track everything from IP generation, traditional invention disclosure, whether that needs IP protection of some form, patenting or whatever that is, right through to a point where we can make an assessment of whether that could be useful outside our organisation, or actually it's so obscure and niche that it's very interesting, but it doesn't necessarily have an application beyond scientific research. So that's a multidisciplinary team that do that. Involves sort of business development, commercial type people, legal and governance, and finance. They're principally the three areas, and they work very, very closely with the scientists through that whole sort of research journey. So it's quite labour intensive. It's quite technical. Even the support staff have to have a degree of scientific understanding, and then we use outside help when we need to. If we need specific help with IP law, for example, we'll go outside for that type of help. That's all managed through software system, IP software systems, and technology transfer software systems.
So I'm just intrigued about, so the ideas for research projects come from the outside world. Is that right? Where someone's saying, we've got some money to do this, give us a pitch.
Yeah, so typically what you would see is the outside world would say, we want to understand X better in the ocean environment, or we have a problem here in the ocean environment and we need to understand how to overcome that. So they tend to throw a question out there with funding behind it, and then you would pitch to that funding body to say, well, we're going to undertake this research project, and that will answer this problem or this question that you have. So it's sort of, we're answering questions that are set by funding bodies. Yeah.
So in that's interesting. And presumably, are you doing that in competition? Have you got rival organisations?
Yeah. So if you look at the NOC, we're one of probably 5 centres like ourselves globally, with the sort of size and horsepower to do what we do. So in that sense, yes, there are sort of natural direct competitors. Excuse me. And then other competitors would be universities who perhaps have certain expertise in this particular area of ocean science. So yes, it's a competitive landscape in simple terms.
So I'm actually intrigued about that, because my background is business development and doing things like that. So presumably then when you're making a competitive bid, it's some sort of technical sales quality part of the bid, and then there's money.
Yeah.
So when you win, or when you don't win, do you, when you break down why you haven't won, is it always the money, or is it someone's got more firepower in a particular engineering or science discipline?
No, I think this is the nuance to the normal commercial sort of way of operating in that business development space. A lot of the questions that have the funding behind them have a set budget, so it's often not almost about the money. There's your proposals are usually judged by a range of people on a panel, and you do get feedback on that. So it's quite hard to generalize, but if I was sort of backed into a corner, I would say actually it's probably not about the cost of money. It's more about sort of slightly different scientific expertise that was more favoured by the panel in one particular area. So it's that space typically where the real competition is.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. Now, just going back to, you pitch for these research projects.
Yeah.
And then you were also talking about IP generation. So is this IP that's not owned by the funder that you've generated?
Yeah.
How do you work that out? Because that sounds like a minefield.
It can be a minefield. So different funding organisations have different rules on the creation of IP, i.e. effectively who owns it, and any limitations on what you can do with it. Most funding bodies, they allow you to own the IP that you generate. And they don't really put many limitations on what you can do with that IP. And the fundamental reason for that is ultimately a lot of the funding bodies, it's public money that's behind it. So they want the information and the IP that you create to be shared. They don't want to sort of squirrel that away themselves in some back office government department. So it works on a very open and transparent principle. So typically, once we've done our research, we would publish academic papers off the back of that. They would be freely available. They might go into journals, but ultimately they're readable by anyone. But the rights to the IP that has developed that are typically ours. Yeah.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
Well, it's a bit like having almost like a treasure trove of all this kind of technical engineering, scientific stuff, and you've got to be careful what you wish for, because you sort of open up this treasure trove and look into all this IP, and you can be a little bit overwhelmed. Say, what am I going to do? What am I going to do with this? A, how do I make sense of it? And B, where is it potentially relevant? In the, I don't know, offshore energy world, or ports and harbours in that industry, and the skill set that's required to match this bit of IP here, which is fundamental science, to smart ports or decarbonisation in the northeast of England. That's quite a niche business development skill set to be able to do that. And I think that's a real kind of innovative space. Doing that at pace and doing that at scale to achieve impact from the fundamental research is really what separates out really great organisations in this space to others.
Let's explore that a bit more. So in my mind's eye, I'm seeing you've got this massive hopper of IP that you've already developed.
Yeah.
Plus there's stuff going into it all the time.
Yeah.
And somehow you've got to unpick that. And the first thing I suppose you've got to have you got to protect it in some way. Then you've got to, but before that, I suppose you've got to say, is it worth spending the money protecting it? So what's the potential for commercialisation or benefit to the community?
Yeah.
I mean, this must be quite a complicated thing.
It is. I mean, my simple mind or view of it is, how do you know which horse to back, which is the right one that's going to win in terms of the IP? I think that the way that we approach it is, we try and get involved early on in the development of the IP, and we try and find, even at that sort of almost idea stage, we try and whittle down ultimately where this could be used outside of our organisation and the research that we do. And by doing that early on, you can often identify perhaps potential industry partners who may want to be involved in the research, or actually they want to be involved, after, when it reaches a certain point. So getting early involvement in this whole process from business development perspective is really, really important. Trying to sort of understand where this has applicability and almost lining up your sort of ducks early on. That's absolutely essential. The IP protection piece, I think you can probably over-intellectualize it. I think often gut instinct is the thing to go with here, but it's more of a timing thing. So if we want protection and we know that we need protection, when in that whole IP development process, because I think a lot of people typically go, quick slap a patent on it, spend a huge amount of money trying to do all that kind of prior art due diligence early on, but they've not really thought about, well, to what end am I protecting this IP? So timing for IP protection is the really crucial bit, and always being able to answer the question around, to what end do I want to protect this? Like what's my end goal? And actually, does it need protection? So yeah, that is quite a tricky process.
And what's the end output of the business development function? So you've sifted through, you've segmented all your IP, protected it where you need to, and then you want it exploited and presumably monetized in some way. So what does that bit look like?
So I mean, there's two fundamental goals from this IP. The first one is to create impact, and that's quite fluffy. I appreciate that, but we don't exist to make loads of money. We're not a commercial organisation. We want to see our science used outside of a research context for the benefit of humanity and creating sort of global impact where we can. And then the second element, of course, is to generate income, because that income just goes back into funding our research. So it's this sort of virtuous circle. So that end bit, typically, I mean, we've got quite a good reputation. So we do get a lot of people approaching us who've worked with us before, interested in certain areas of IP with a view to effectively licensing that, like a normal kind of technology licensing. So we certainly do that. Other pieces we do is we'll take the IP or the expertise around that particular IP, and we will do ad hoc consultancy for certain organisations. And then really the third element, which is probably the most intensive but ultimately most exciting, is really to say, where could we almost go it alone? So we're not set up as an organisation to start being a normal business and trading in that way, but actually what if we did? What if we had something that was so good we didn't want to license it, because that almost not extracting as much value as we can from it? What if we set up a spin out, or we set up a new legal entity, and we created a business that was based on core IP that we'd already created? So that's the space that we're in now with certain technology, and specifically around some of this sort of autonomous submersible technology that we've developed.
We'll come on to that slightly later on. That's been a really fascinating insight into what you do day to day and the work of the NOC. Now, when I think you were talking to Ashlyn, who's the director, producer and editor of this podcast, you mentioned that you have a vehicle called Boaty McBoatface.
Indeed, yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit about Boaty?
Sure. So some people might have heard of Boaty McBoatface. So I'll sort of start with where we are now and almost go back, actually. So Boaty McBoatface is a 2.5 metre long, completely autonomous, i.e. no one in it or no one controlling it with a remote control, underwater submarine that can go all over the world down to depths of 6,000 metres. And the primary purpose of that is to pack it full of different sensors and really clever kit and go and understand different things about the ocean. So it's effectively a taxi, right? And then you pack it full of really cool scientific kit. So that is what Boaty McBoatface is. Bright yellow thing with Boaty written on the side.
Literally a yellow submarine.
Literally a yellow submarine, indeed. The name of that was something that went out to public vote for our Polar Explorer vessel, and we ended up adopting it because the Polar Explorer vessel was called Sir David Attenborough, something different.
Quite right.
So we took the Boaty McBoatface name and we've adopted that. Yeah.
So this vehicle goes down to 6,000 metres.
Yeah.
That's pretty deep.
Yeah.
And it goes all over the world, and it presumably you can swap out the sensors and the experimentations that it does.
Yeah. So the way that it typically works is you're absolutely right. You decide what data or variables about the ocean you want to understand in a particular area. You would then build a sensor fit or payload to go and capture that data. You would integrate that into the vehicle, and then you do various testing, calibration, etc. And then effectively you've got two options for going to capture that data. You either take the Boaty on a research vessel, launch it over the side and off it goes, or you can launch it from a beach, so shore launched. and it'll swim off and go and collect that data and swim back. So all of that sort of pre-mission planning and everything is all done on land, sort of inloaded into the machine, and then it uses some clever engineering and navigation once it's down doing its thing, to go and collect this data, and then we use a sort of remote control system when we need to give it directions when possible. But the obvious thing about operating underwater is it's really hard to communicate. So there's some options about how we.
So this thing's untethered.
Completely untethered. Yeah.
Now just tell me, 6,000 metres is a long way down. When you're down at that depth, that's 600 bar, 600 times the atmosphere, if I remember
roughly.
University physics. Surely that vehicle must have been through some massive amounts of testing.
I mean, the story of Boaty is a really, really interesting one, and I'll just sort of summarise it because it does answer this question. But the development of this type of equipment started way back in the early 80s, but it wasn't until sort of 1996, 1997 that the first version of this sort of went into the water. So in one sense you could say it's been 40 years worth of testing to get to the point of what we've got now. Now clearly technology develops in that time as well, but you're absolutely right. So the typical sort of development regime would be design the sensor fit that you want to put in. You'd load all that on land. We've got onshore testing capabilities in-house, so we can put it in some water, ballast it, make sure everything's working. Before you go and throw it into the middle of an ocean in a storm, because it's expensive kit, we would typically do some inland water testing in deep water. So we tend to use Loch Ness. It's a great site, really secluded, nice and deep, and it's safe. Ultimately, if something goes wrong,
there's always the potential to find something interesting.
There's the amount of times I've been asked that. So we typically go and do test regime up there, put it through its paces. Then we take it out to sea, but kind of near shore, somewhere off the coast of the UK typically, again in a kind of controlled environment, do a whole host of sea trial testing. And it's only at that point really that we would then go and use it for the mission that it's being developed for. So that seems quite slim, but you've got to remember that there's 40 years almost of engineering behind that. So the design architecture we're pretty confident about. So what we're really testing in that process I just went through is the integration of upgrades to navigational systems and comms, but the new sensor fit that we put inside it.
And I suppose the big difference between this vehicle and a manned submarine is it a pressure vessel in quite the same way as a manned one? I mean, it doesn't have to be support life, does it?
No, it doesn't have to support life. So the basic architecture is that the brains and the battery is inside a pressure vessel, and that sits in the middle of the vehicle. The front and the back is flooded, so you can put sensors in there and things like that.
There's no difference in pressure.
But there's no difference in pressure on those flooded areas. So it works on that concept. But you're absolutely right, it doesn't need to support life. So you don't need to carry oxygen, for example. You can shut things down to conserve power. You can go slower, or you can do similar things you do with humans in. But fundamentally, if this thing gets lost, okay, you've lost a lot of money in the scientific data, but that's it.
Now, I mean, this is very topical because as we record this, it's just a week after the tragedy in the Atlantic when that sort of, I suppose the best way to call it is research vehicle Titan was lost, which is that science stroke tourist vehicle developed by OceanGate. I'm not asking you to comment too much on that itself, other than the difference between that and Boaty and McBoatface is there was 5 people needed to survive in there.
Yeah.
It wasn't going down 6,000 metres. It didn't quite make it to 4,000, did it? So the contrast is Boaty McBoatface is the culmination of 40 years of development.
Yeah, it is, and the ultimate uses of comparing those two vehicles are completely different, and the level of risk, of course, is completely different. So I'm not aware of the full testing regime with that, and I'm sure there'll be an investigation that goes on. Obviously, I can't sort of comment until that point, but they are fundamentally engineered very, very differently. And you've got to remember, we're a research organisation with 55 PhD level engineers developing our kit, so we have a lot of confidence in that. That's not to say there's not confidence in other vessels that exist out there, but we're in that position. So it's fundamentally a different ask of the engineering, and I think that presents very different challenges.
We've come to the end of our time. It's been really fascinating, and I thank you very much for appearing on this episode of Innovation Deciphered.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It's been great.